Welcome to today's show, and we have a buffet of issues for you to consider. Short-term rentals, are they a solution for families in tough economic times, or are they a problem in families needing housing in PenTALKton? Neighborhood charm, we know PenTALKton is going to change, so we have a project where we're talking to residents before proposals come to the table. Utility rate review, no one likes increases, but how do we balance them with the need to fix existing infrastructure and meet new demand? And bike lanes. The design phase is beginning on the final phase of the lake-to-lake route. Lots of questions, and we'll get some answers. So that's the menu on this edition of PenTALKton. I'm Shane Mills, joined by Joanne Klebb, and now I'm hungry because I kept talking about a buffet, Joanne. But I think it's probably really just indicative of the number of issues that the city of PenTALKton is facing.
Yeah, absolutely. Things are really getting going. We have our new council firmly in place, and we're seeing a lot of projects coming to the table and a lot of stuff happening.
And two of the people who are very busy telling us where we should be going on some of these projects are getting the background information. Council ultimately, I guess, gets to decide on where we go with these things. We have Blake Lavin, Director of Development Services, or as I like to call him, the City Planner, and Kristen Dixon is the General Manager of Infrastructure. We're going to start with short-term rentals, Blake. So you have been tasked with something. Tell us what that is first.
Sure, and thanks for having me on here. It's always great to sit down and chat city issues with you guys. Short-term rentals, they have been, I'd say PenTALKton's been a leader with regard to regulating short-term rentals. We've licensed them since about 2011, but I think in more recent years, there have been questions about the number and the impact that short-term rentals are having on our long-term availability of rental and housing, ownership housing as well. And these questions are coming up at the same time that the housing market has really tightened in the last few years. And as rents go up and housing prices go up, people are asking questions about what's causing these issues. And one of the answers that keeps popping up is short-term rentals. So council has asked us to look at the impact that short-term rentals are having on our housing affordability in the community, as well as the impact that they're having on our hospitality industry as well.
So you mentioned the hospitality industry. So I had friends who wanted to come up last summer. They wanted to come up for the Elvis Festival. That's their thing. Couldn't find a hotel room. So I would think that in the summer, short-term rentals are a good thing for PenTALKton overall because they afford people more opportunity to come here.
Yeah, there's a few things going on there. First, just we don't have enough hotel rooms to meet our demand in the summer. This is obviously an amazing place. It's a special place. We have world-class events that happen here every year, and we just don't have enough hotel rooms. And the other piece to it is not everybody's looking for a hotel room. I think people are coming up with their families. People are coming up for endurance events and different sporting events that they have lots of gear with them. And they're just looking for a different type of accommodation. And with the rise of Airbnb and vacation rental websites, you're seeing people really embrace staying in a residential neighborhood and enjoying that more than staying in a traditional hotel with the limitations that might be there.
Well, one of the funny stories that Blake and I heard when we were doing engagement on the short-term rental project was how PenTALKton was really at the forefront of short-term rentals. We heard that, like back in the day, in the early days of Ironman and back in the peak summer, the city would encourage the community to let people tent in their yards to try to accommodate the peak activity that we were seeing in the summer season.
Yeah, PenTALKton has a long history of giving up their houses for residents during summer events. I think
they can get money and they can get out of town.
Yeah, no, it was, and my father was a teacher, and that was the joke that teachers would just rent their houses out all summer long and make more money renting their houses out, and they would go on these great trips in the summer. But yeah, I think PenTALKton's got a long history of this. When we were doing research for this project, we pulled some old PenTALKton Heralds from the 1980s and all sorts of ads for short-term rentals along the lakes or in areas during Peach Fest, during Ironman. So I think even before the advent of Airbnb and these online platforms, we've really embraced the short-term rental in PenTALKton. But now we're getting to the point where there's a lot more in the community, and we're looking at what impact they actually do have.
So you mentioned housing, and everyone is worried about housing affordability. Our vacancy rate is still very low. Even though you are building a lot of projects, it's still not enough as people want to move here. We have like a 9% growth rate or something. Are we seeing where people are like, I'll take that condo, and then all it is a short-term rental?
We are seeing some dwelling units that are created, so people will put a basement suite in for the sole purpose of doing a vacation rental. Not so much on the new condo construction. We're not seeing those converted to vacation rentals. I know that's certainly a trend in other communities and larger centers, but we are definitely seeing some purpose-built units, more a carriage house or a secondary suite. The majority of our vacation rentals are on properties where the operator does live on site, and they're doing this as a mortgage helper, or they're doing it as a side job. A lot of retired people do this after they're retired to make additional money and meet travelers as they come through. There's so many different reasons why people do these, and through this project we've had opportunities to talk to all sorts of different people, and yeah, there's no one reason why people are doing this. It's not just about the money. It's about welcoming people to the community. It's about
right. So we have a very specific summer season, right? Basically, May, start of September, maybe, right? So what happens to these short-term rentals when no one's coming to PenTALKton? Is that something that, I guess what I'm getting to is this actually a way to help the housing market? I'm thinking of students in particular who go to Okanagan College and they need a place to stay. The timing works nice. They're here from September to May, then they're gone. Is there a lot of that, I guess, is what I'm asking.
Yeah, short answer, yes. I think the short-term rentals are used by students in the off-season. They're used by hockey billets. They're used by all longer-term rental. I know at the city we place people in short-term rentals when we hire new employees and they're coming. They would get the short-term rental for a few months while they acclimate to the city and figure out where they want to live longer term. So I think when you're looking at the ledger, that's on the benefits side of it. But the study is really looking at, and we've been talking with people like the college and the hospital that I think do place people there short term, but they're also saying that the housing market is so tight right now that they're having problems. Students are having problems actually enrolling here because the rental houses prices are so high. The hospital, different industries are having problems recruiting people because housing prices are so high. And I think this is going on at the same time as there's more short-term rentals. So there is a tendency, I think, to look at them and place some blame, some criticism. And I think it'd be naive to say that they're not having an impact, but it's what level of impact that is and whether it's an acceptable level of impact for all the benefit that we're getting.
So I know one of the things that you did earlier this year with one of our bylaws is, I'm going to use the phrase, jacked up the license fees for short-term rentals. And I guess not everyone, I think, understands there are different types of short-term rentals. Do we need to just raise the prices and make sure that people are registering? Because I think if there's a frustration, it'd probably be with oh, look, I know Joanne's renting her place out and she didn't even get a business license and I'm trying to follow the rules.
Yeah, we definitely heard that from the operators that they would like to see us do more enforcement on unlicensed. But yeah, Blake, what are the different types?
So there's 3 different types of short-term rentals that we license in the city. And I should say, if people are interested in trying it out, you can list on Airbnb for up to 7 days a year without having to get licensed or have inspections or do anything. And that's just for people to try it out, see if they like it. But once you get more than that, there's the minor home-based or the minor short-term rental, which allows you to rent up to a certain number of days per year. Then there's the major, which I would say is the majority. Over 75% of the licensed businesses that we have are the vacation rental major, which allows you to have up to 6 people in your unit, 2 people per bedroom, up to a maximum of 6. And then there's no limit on how many days a year that you can go. And then the higher category is the major category, which does involve neighborhood consultation before we would issue that type of license. And that allows you to have more than 6 people on your site. And we have very few of those in the community. And we do audit those as well to make sure that there are no negative impacts from those ones. We did raise the rates recently, and that was through a review of how much it was costing us to do all the enforcement. There's still a gap between the number of short-term rentals that are operating in the community and the number that are actually licensed. So that's our enforcement effort, is trying to close that gap. And that's really what our focus has been. So we did raise rates to help us with that enforcement effort, but also make sure that the short-term rentals that we do have are safe, inspected on a regular basis, and monitored.
I realize I've just broken the golden rule of journalism. How many short-term rentals do we have in PenTALKton? So can you give us a perspective so people understand?
It sounds like an easy question to answer, but it's actually a lot.
How many are licensed?
That much easier question to answer. We've issued 363 licenses for short-term rentals, but again, at any given time, there could be up to 500 that we're seeing in the peak seasons that are being advertised for rental. But again, it's even out of the ones that we have licensed, they don't advertise all year long. They have the license. It doesn't mean that they're active short-term rentals. So, and
just for perspective, so there's 500 short-term rentals. How many housing units are there in PenTALKton, give or take?
About 18,400, somewhere in that ballpark. And I will say, one of the jobs that the consultants that we've hired to look at this are doing is trying to figure out that number, what the actual number is, and they are looking at equivalents to long-term housing units, and I think they're around the 250. So if you were looking at an exact equivalency, it would be about 250. But that number has actually risen close to 40% in the past year. So I think we're comfortable where we're at now, but if we keep rising at the rate that we're rising, the impacts are going to start to outweigh some of the benefits that we're seeing. And these are the questions that I think council wants to get more information on. And when they're going to make decisions on changes to the program, they're going to want to have all this information at hand.
When you report back to council, is it going to be that sort of, look, it is sort of a both scenario here. There are a lot of really positive benefits, particularly in the summer, and there are some drawbacks, and we just need to find that balance.
What council is going to have to give us direction on is these values. Like, is it, are you having your preference on long-term rental, or are you having your preference on visitor accommodation? And that's the direction that they're going to have to give us.
All right.
Yeah, we should talk a little bit about what's next for this, and then we can start diving into our next topic. And so in terms of what's next, so we've just wrapped up a survey of the community and the operators. We had over 1,100 people participate in just the community survey alone. So clearly a lot of interest on this topic in the community, and lots of great data for us to represent to council on what the community's views are. And we also heard from the operators. So we heard from about 250 operators. So that voice is also being heard in this process. So pretty soon here, this information will be shared. Everything you're hearing today will be shared with council, and they'll be able to provide us with guidance on how they want to move forward.
Speaking of guidance on moving forward, neighborhood charm. I know this is a project you guys are focused on 2 neighborhoods in the city. I'll let you talk about that. And to me, at least, it seemed like a really kind of cool idea where you're talking to, you're not going in and saying, someone is proposing to build an infill and do this and do that. You're trying to get their feedback first. Do I have that right?
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. These are 2 areas that we're seeing a lot of development interest. And it seemed like every development file that came forward.
Sorry, I didn't take good notes. Can you just tell us which 2 neighborhoods we're talking about?
So the 2 neighborhoods that the Neighborhood Charm Project is looking at is the Windsor Avenue, which has colloquially been called Cherryland, and then the Lakeshore Drive area. And these are 2 areas that we've seen a lot of development interest, and it just seemed like every development application that came forward, there was opposition to the placement of buildings on the lots, the types of buildings, the heights. there wasn't, I would say in both neighborhoods, there isn't an opposition to development happening. It was really just the style of development that was happening. So I think this neighborhood charm idea came out of an effort to try to predetermine with the neighborhoods what would acceptable developments be in these areas, because I think developers too, they want to go into these areas because they're very large lots, older building stock, opportunities for development. They want to come in and realize redevelopment of these areas. Our official community plan directs development to these areas, but this project is really trying to distill down what makes these neighborhoods special and how can we adjust our bylaws in ways that make it clear when developers do come that they're going to meet those that existing DNA in those areas, and won't have the opposition because the neighborhood will have already bought into certain.
I'm guessing though there's still going to be a challenge there, because right now everyone is saying, "Yeah, this is great. This is what we'd like," until someone builds beside them, and all of a sudden, their shade tree is missing or something.
Yeah, there's always a risk with new development impacting existing, but this project is really meant to try to mitigate that. So both these neighborhoods were built under a previous zoning bylaw, mostly the 1947 bylaw that had really large front yards, had lower heights, different side yard setbacks, and in subsequent zoning bylaws and changes to city policy, now developers can come in and build much closer to the street. They can build higher types of buildings. So when a new development goes in, it's very jarring to the neighborhood because the building sticks out a lot closer to the street than the prevailing building line, or the building might be 2.5 stories where the rest of the neighborhood is 1.5 stories. So what this project does is really looks at what the DNA of these neighborhoods are and tries to match the regulations to that DNA. So developers can still go in and build the duplex that they wanted to build, but it's just going to be pushed back a little bit from the street, opportunities to have the landscaping and fit in a lot better.
As a newcomer, when I run down Lakeshore, it seems somewhat chaotic, the design along Lakeshore. That's just from my outsider's point of view. Like there doesn't seem... There's like an apartment building, and then there's this elegant house that looks like it came from Gone with the Wind, and then there's, I guess, how do you as a planner try and bring all those things together? That doesn't seem easy.
Yeah, and I think that's a great example. Lakeshore Drive was built and is one of the earliest residential neighborhoods in the city's history. It was originally laid out in the original 1908 plan for PenTALKton, large acreages along Lakeshore Drive, and you have some buildings that date back to that time period, but every decade you've seen new housing constructed along there. So you do get this really different mix of architectural styles, but the one thing that you do have in common is these large front yards with generous, mature landscaping on it. But you also notice with the newer developments, they're starting to creep closer to the street, and our zoning bylaw actually allows you to build even closer to the street. So one of the changes we are making is requiring those buildings to be set back to that prevailing building line, which allows that main design feature, which is the large front yards, to still be retained even as new development happens. But yeah, you're right. We're not trying to determine what the architectural style is. Designers, architects, developers can still reflect the changing tastes in building design, but it's really that DNA, the setbacks, the heights that we're trying to protect through this.
Yeah, I'm thinking Lakeshore is unique because it's the public face of the city in many ways, right? Like it's a pretty busy street all summer long, and with the motels there. So it's really, people see that's how PenTALKton puts its face forward, so they don't want to change it too much.
Yeah, I think there's a expectation of a really high level of design there for sure. Anything
else on the neighborhood charm?
Yeah.
I know you guys have been doing that work. When it's also going, council's going to be really busy. When does that go to council?
Yeah, I'll just give you a little bit of background. Like we started on this project last fall, where we did a couple of open houses in the neighborhoods, and we took people on walking tours so they could understand the history and why these neighborhoods were special. And we did that to help them have an informed opinion about whether or not these bylaw changes were right for them. And so we collected some feedback from the community, and now we've processed all that, and we're coming forward with these suggested zoning bylaw changes. So they'll be coming to council on February 7th, and at that time, council will give us direction on whether or not they would like to see this taken out to a public hearing before adopting or refusing the bylaw.
And it's really about bringing some clarity, because we know the city's changing, we know the city's growing, we know we need to adapt to it, but here it's like bringing people along a bit, like tell us how we're going to have to make some changes, help us do this, right?
Yeah, this is really about balancing support for development without overwhelming the community. So one of the key factors that people need to know is that it's still possible to put carriage houses in these areas. We know that the provincial government is wanting to see more units on individual lots. So we're not trying to prevent that. We're just trying to do it in a way that protects the character for the existing residents.
So now, everyone's favorite topic, utility rates.
You say that, but I've done a fair amount of engagement on utility rates, and it really doesn't bring out a lot of people. So I'm hoping for more this year.
And I guess PenTALKton is unique, and it was new to me when I first moved here because we have our own utility. So normally the utility rate review for most cities is water, sewer, and that's a small amount, and no one cares. How much more complicated does it make having our own utility when we do these type of reviews?
Well, I think you're referring to the electric utility, which is the unique to PenTALKton and certainly a benefit to the city to operate. But at the same time, you're right, it does add a layer of complexity. And that's primarily because a big portion of our fixed cost is from buying that bulk energy from Fortis. And so there's a lack of control as opposed to our water and sewer utilities where we directly treat the water or process the sewage and we control those costs. In the electric utility, it's a little more difficult because those fixed costs are set by someone else.
And one of the things we always hear is that people think that they pay more for electricity in PenTALKton. Do you know, is that the case?
Well, that is one of the areas that, again, we're going to look at in this rate review is getting that good comparator to other rates or other utilities and to be able to squash that myth or prove it out one way or the other. How much do you pay relative to those other utilities?
But there would be a benefit, and I guess it's we do pay, even if it's slightly more, the idea would be then, well, that's a benefit to the city because that generates a bit more revenue that we can spend on other projects. That would be the idea, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly one of the things that's also up for review through this process is the dividend. And so for many of those who are familiar with the electric rates in PenTALKton, we do generate a dividend from the electric utility that pays for some of our general capital costs. And that certainly is up for review as well.
So Blake gets to approve all the projects and build the houses, and he's the hero because he's creating housing. But you have to help make sure that they have some of those basics like water and sewer. Plus, we have to maintain infrastructure some of it's probably pretty old.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is a fine balancing act to say how much are we spending on new infrastructure to support growth, and particularly in new areas, as opposed to looking after from an asset management perspective what we already own. And so the utility rate review needs to accommodate both of those funding requirements, new infrastructure as well as existing infrastructure. And
you may not want to answer this question, and so don't. It may be more of a political question, but BC Hydro, which has vast more reserves, the province can say, be careful with what the rates are. And I know council during COVID and during the economic downturn have tried to balance that. At some point, does that catch up to us and we have to pay at some point?
Well, there's no doubt that we have enjoyed low electric utility prices over the last few years. In fact, we've decreased utility rates over the last 5 years relative to some pretty significant increases that we've seen come through from Fortis. And so it's getting to the point now where we've been essentially relying on some savings that we had in our electric utility to offset those annual costs. And certainly the time has come to take a look at what those increases are going to be over the next little while, so that we don't find yourself in a position where we're having to pass on a really large increase at one point. And we're trying to really smooth that increase over a reasonable period of time.
And that, I think that was really what happened with the last rate review, is that there were some fairly steep increases, and that was in order to play catch up because we weren't putting the necessary money aside to properly maintain our assets to sustain those services into the future.
Yeah, certainly, particularly on the sanitary utility side, there were some pretty significant increases. And I think one of the things we want to do in this one as well is make sure that model is set so that when those Fortis fluctuations happen in the future, we can easily accommodate them into our future rates and know what those are going to look like from a City of Penticton utility rate payer perspective.
So how much of your utility rate review is, for lack of a better word, a public education campaign so that people understand? Because I think people living in British Columbia, we have dams, we have Site C, powers everywhere. They take for granted, I think, a little bit how expensive it is, all the infrastructure. How much of it is a public education campaign? Yes, you pay this, but this is what you get. Because I think people tend to take it for granted that the power is going to come on when they flip the light switch.
Yeah, I think that's one of the difficult parts of this exercise. It's not dissimilar to the DCC exercise that we just went through, where we know how much money we need to generate. That's not really up for debate. That we know the projects, we know the costs that we can anticipate, we know how much it costs us to treat water and to treat sewage and all those kinds of things. What matters in this exercise is trying to figure out who should pay what amount. And so how do we break that down between the various residential customers, the commercial customers? Like, how do we determine what is equitable? And luckily on the utility side, most of it is, a user pay system. So we have water meters, we have electric meters, and we've used that very numerical basis to determine who should and shouldn't pay. And so a lot of it is education. A lot of it is just it's a calculation, really.
So, like, for the next, you have a 3-year capital plan. Like, on the capital side, like, what are the big investments that we have to make in terms of our utilities?
Yeah, we're in a really good position right now because we've just updated all of our master plans in the last couple of years. So we have a really good idea of what those long range capital plans and capital needs are, both from a growth and development perspective, but also from an asset management perspective. And we know the numbers are pretty significant. We're getting to the point where, Penticton, a lot of our infrastructure went in around the 60s or so, and it's coming due for renewal. So we do have some pretty big demands over the next few years. And as I said, again, we want to be looking out as far as we can so we can smooth those increases over time and make sure that we're not overly being burdensome in one particular year.
Something just popped into my head. So the City of Penticton has been a leader when it comes to dealing with climate change, not only setting a plan for the city, sort of the greater city, but also for the City of Penticton itself. How much do those changes potentially impact moving towards electric vehicles, promoting those type of things? So that's going to create more demand on the system. And I wonder if people always put those pieces together.
Yeah, I think that is going to be one of the really interesting things that we have to grapple with as a community, is how we're going to support the electrification goals of our Community Climate Action Plan, of the Clean BC program provincially. We know that we're moving towards electrification of everything that we can because of the lower carbon footprint. But our grid, we need to make sure we can manage that capacity. And, it's not dissimilar to water or anything else, where everything comes down to peak usage. And so for the most part, yes, can we supply everything for most of the day? Yes. But in that, right after everyone gets home from work and they start their loads of laundry and they're cooking dinner and they plug in their car, we're going to need to manage those peaks and figure out how do we manage those in the best way so that we're not having to build infrastructure for the peak usage.
So this review, it's just starting, right?
We've just kicked it off. We'll actually be having a kickoff meeting relatively quickly here. The next stages on that is that we'll be doing some public engagement fairly early on in that process, presenting a draft report to council, circling back to those the feedback we get through the public engagement and finalizing that before we bring forward a recommendation. And really we're working towards having those recommendations in place before we get into the next budget cycle here later in the year.
And a lot of the work that the consultants will be doing is data gathering, right? What kind of data will they be pulling together for us?
Yeah, they'll be peeling through all of our budgets, whether it's our operating budget, our capital budgets, our DCC program, looking at our growth projections, looking at our revenue needs over the next few years. They'll also be comparing, as we said earlier, to those other communities, other utilities, and trying to, there's obviously the calculation side of how much do we need to generate, but there's also that how is that equitable and fair relative to what others are paying elsewhere. So that kind of gut check to make sure are our rates generally in line with what others are paying and making sure that is fair.
Yeah, and so something that's interesting about the utility rate review, like there's a fairly consistent formula every time they're reviewed, but you usually try and explore a few unique questions through it. And I think this time we're looking at block water rates. And as the city's communicator, I'm already trying to wrap my head around how the heck am I going to help people understand block water rates. So maybe, Kristen, you could take a run at it now.
Yeah, I think thanks, Joanne, for mentioning that, because I think it is a topic that we're going to have to talk about. So we know, again, when I talk about this peak consumption, we can accommodate a fair amount of growth with our existing water treatment plant because of the amount of water that we can treat per day and deliver through our distribution system. But when you start looking at that peak usage, when it's a really hot day, we're in the middle of irrigation season, people are using those pools and that water demand really spikes, that will limit how many, new customers, for example, we can add on, or it'll increase the cost of, we'll have to do additional capital upgrades to accommodate that. And so the idea behind an increasing block rate structure is that you are incentivizing conservation measures. And we have those conservation measures in place. And it is a difficult conversation because, quite frankly, PenTALKton is in a fairly good position. We have abundant sources of water. We have a water treatment plant that has more capacity than we currently need. And so we do have water available, but as a species and as humans, we know that we are using a lot more, particularly in the Okanagan, than elsewhere in Canada. And if we can drop that peak consumption, we can make that asset last a lot longer into the future and keep our costs down, which again drives those utility rates.
So let me see if I can capture that. So through this process, we will be consulting with the community to see if they want to go to a block rate structure for water rates. And what that will do is reward people who conserve water and penalize those who are using it during peak rates.
It's not necessarily when they're using it. If you use a higher amount of volume, as you use more and more water, you will pay a higher rate for that water. So it's not dissimilar to, say, income taxes. Okay. As you make more money, you pay a higher rate on that additional income that you make to basically offset the overall cost, because that is really those big water users are driving that peak consumption, which is driving our utility costs.
Yeah, so when you see those ads looking for you to share your opinion on utility rates and be part of the review, this is the question that we're asking. So we need the community to help us understand if this is the shift they want us to make. So
I'll be interested because most people are going to go, yeah, people who use more should.
Maybe.
It's like income tax. Yeah. Until they realize, wait a minute.
That's me.
I got 4 kids. I'm always doing laundry. Right?
Yeah, exactly.
So it'll be interesting to see what that feedback is.
Yeah.
So, speaking of feedback, something that I think Kristen's had a lot of feedback on over the last little while, bike lanes. So we're now moving to the final design phase. And I think it's fair to say people were surprised to discover that it wasn't done. I think in most people's mind, there's a lot of people who thought the final phase was done.
Haven't we designed this thing already?
Yeah.
Well, I think, we largely have. And to be honest, the last section of the Lake to Lake route is the easiest section because there are already painted bike lanes on South Main Street. And so really this is an exercise of delineating and separating them. But it's not the same of the other sections where we are essentially going in and redesigning the entire cross section.
So the one thing I've heard from people is like, aren't you just creating a problem? It already works on South Main. Why do you have to change it?
I think that opens up just that philosophical debate around the intent of all ages and abilities infrastructure. There is no doubt that it works for some, and for those who are comfortable riding with traffic, absolutely. The bike lanes on South Main serve a purpose. But what we're trying to do is create infrastructure that opens the door up to those who aren't currently using it because they're not comfortable in that environment.
And you're now hitting a really active area, the senior center, pickleballers. Is that one going to look different, feel different?
There is actually a fair amount of already available parking on the street on South Main. And for most of that, we will be able to accommodate that and maintain that. We have much more road width, much more right-of-way width down South Main than we have in the other corridors. And so we are able to maintain parking. And what we're going to do is try and create more like parking pockets. So rather than right now, you see it almost essentially down the entire stretch. You'll see
just on one side, though.
Just on one side, correct. Sorry. Thanks, Joanne. We'll be trying to create some parking pockets for those uses where we know there is higher demands, like along the parks, like adjacent to the temple and those circumstances.
By the pickleball courts.
By the pickleball courts. Of course, the pickleball courts. But yeah, so there's that aspect. And then there are some higher use areas, as you said. But for the most part, they do have driveways that pull in and out, and those are perfectly safe, and we'll accommodate those in the design, and we don't anticipate any issues. The trickiest part will be the South Main Market. There is no doubt that existing parking scenario is a challenge as it is today, even just backing out over a sidewalk and a painted bike lane, and in fact, backing out into oncoming traffic. So we're working with those property owners to come up with some solutions that are going to work for everyone. And we're excited about what that corridor is going to look like when it's completed.
So, just so I have it straight in my own head, on the South Main, it will be 2 bike lanes, one on each side of the road. It won't be like it is on Martin where it's a dual lane.
That's right. So it'll be unidirectional. So you'll have the same flow of bike traffic with the same direction of vehicle traffic. And then we'll have that parking available on one side. And actually right now it's only on the west side. We may alternate that to have some on the east side because we know there is some uses if you go further down where there's some townhouses, for example. We know they're parking on the west side and running across. We want to try and perhaps scatter that parking out. And that's part of what we'll be looking for when we do our public engagement, is to hear where exactly are parking and where are people parking, where do they live, so that we can try and accommodate some of that, perhaps on-street visitor type parking a little bit closer and more accessible.
Have you learned anything from the first 3 that you're going to take and use on this final phase? I guess from my own perspective, thinking of all the signage on Martin, which I occasionally find distracting, and even sometimes watching buses trying to turn, that it's a little tight for them with the way the lanes are. Are there lessons that you've already learned that you'll be able to take and make this a smoother transition?
Yes, definitely. We've heard similar feedback around, the volume of signage, the volume of paint markings, some of those things. The offset to that is that we knew we were trying to mitigate the impact, so we didn't remove, for example, in the first few sections, there were some driveways that we left in place that quite frankly don't need to be there. And because those driveways exist, we now need to sign them and make sure they're safe. And so part of the clutter in that section has led to the amount of driveway, or is a result of how many driveways were left in place. But we also know that it was a fairly new infrastructure for PenTALKton. This was our first separated infrastructure. And so certainly the design was very cautious around making sure it was abundantly clear how people were to drive and behave. And I think now that people are getting acclimated to the infrastructure, we can probably scale that back a little bit and look at perhaps a little less signage and a little less painting, because it's more intuitive now how to use the infrastructure.
And that's a stretch that people are used to. It's not closed, but it's a stretch where cars are used to cyclists being on the road with them.
Yeah, and again, we have a little bit more road width there, so it's not as challenging to accommodate all the uses in that stretch, which will make it a lot easier. And just one thing, though, further, we are going to be taking all the lessons learned that we have had so far and possibly circling back, and we'll be talking to council about that. Are there some tweaks we need to make to those first few phases that we completed now a number of years ago, based on the feedback that we are hearing? And, for example, the design line. You either love it or you hate it. That's the wavy kind of plastic looking stuff. Again, I think, the intention was to do something that was perhaps in some people's minds a little nicer than standard concrete. But I think actually Now that we've seen it in use, it kind of detracts from that streetscape on Martin, where we already have, beautiful patios and pergolas and other things. And so I think, by going through some of these exercises, we've learned maybe what does work and what doesn't work in those different settings. And we'll be taking a step back to say, okay, do we need to make some tweaks to this?
So I guess people always, there will always be those who are critical of the bike lanes. You're never going to change their mind. But at what point do you start to look and say, I guess, do we have to wait until it is the lake-to-lake bike route before we start deciding whether it's a success or not?
How we evaluate success, we still need to figure that out. What does that look like? Because it will mean different things to different people. Many people have said, we can't evaluate it until the lake-to-lake route is done. Others would say, well, you can't actually evaluate it until you have an entire network, because you can't get from where you want to go. So you can't really measure the full impact of it. So I think that's still something we need to take away and say, okay, what does success look like and how do we properly evaluate it? But there's no doubt that having that initial spine created is the starting point. And then we need to figure out how do we best build out that network in a way that is acceptable and useful to the community.
So piqued my interest when you said build out that network. Is that going to mean just more painted bike lanes, or is that going to mean more controlled bike lanes?
So we did quite a comprehensive network plan as part of our master transportation plan. And so we have some recommendations around where those kind of key east-west connections should be. Some of them separated, some of them, shared use. There's the BC Ministry has active transportation guidelines that kind of sets out, how many cars are on a street and what is the speed limit of that, and helps you determine whether they should be separated or not. So there's lots of guidelines out there that help us make those decisions. So for example, we had brought forward to council as part of the last federal active transportation fund to apply for Green Avenue. We are waiting on hearing about those, but we know we need to talk to the community about what those next steps look like. What are those streets? Lakeshore Drive is another example. We hear the feedback around the success of the walkway, but also how that is becoming problematic because it's so successful that we have the conflict between bikes and pedestrians. So we're going to have to tackle these issues as a community, and there's no easy answers. We have limited amount of right of way, and we need to find a way to make it safe for everybody.
My last question on the bike lanes. Active transportation is actually really cost effective and a good use of money. Like, I'm making that as a statement and you're nodding, but I actually really believe that. Can you explain why?
It's the cost to build, car infrastructure or car dominated infrastructure is significantly more expensive. It takes up more space. Cars are heavier. They cause more damage to the road network.
We don't have any other place to build more roads.
We don't.
Like, we're stuck between two lakes, which is great most of the time, but we're limited where we can put roads.
We do, and we know we have more people moving to the community. Blake's trying to find places for them all to live. And as those people come, we don't have any more road network capacity to put more cars on the road. In fact, we know we need to be doing the opposite. More than 50% of our greenhouse gas emissions are coming from the transportation sector. So we need to tackle that. And that's not to say, I think everyone gets caught up in whether they personally can get rid of their car or whatnot, or eliminate some of those trips. But every person who does is a benefit to everybody. So if there are some people who can switch to bikes or can switch to walking or other modes, it makes it easier for those people who have to drive to actually get from A to B, which is some of the frustration we're hearing as congestion increases.
Or if they only do it half the time.
Exactly.
Like, at least they have the option then. Right?
Yeah.
So, Joanne, anything you wanted to add on bike lanes?
So we will be notifying the residents along South Main when there are opportunities to come out and talk to staff. And so just make sure you're registered with Shape Your City so you can get emails directly and watch your mailbox.
And so you'll have like an artist's rendering of what it might look like for them.
We'll have the same level of detailed design plans that we've had for the previous phases. We'll make them available on the Shape Your City website. We'll likely be hosting some information sessions online as well again, so we can walk people through kind of block by block. And show them what it's going to mean. And again, I anticipate because this section is much more straightforward, I think it's going to look a lot easier when people see it on paper. Just the lower number of driveways, there's the bigger complexes that it's just not quite the same challenge that we've had in the previous sections.
That is it for PenTALKton today. Joanne, do you want to tell people how they can follow the city accounts and find out when the next edition of PenTALKton is?
Yeah, every time we finish a podcast, well, first we release it on your podcast streaming services, on Apple and Spotify, all the big ones, Google Play, and then we release it. It's also available on YouTube, and we advertise it on social media and on Castanet, so it's pretty easy to find.
All right. I'm Shane Mills on behalf of Joanne Klebb and our guests, Blake Lavin and Kristen Dixon. Thanks for listening.